All right, thanks so much for having me. Thanks, Colette, for the intro. I'm really excited to be here and to kick off today's conference. Though I gotta be honest, I can really think of no weirder topic to kick off a UXR conference than a talk talking about parallels between baseball analytics and UX research. It seems a little bit odd to me. But nonetheless, here we are. I sure hope this lands. But anyways, my name is Joris Drayer. I am a researcher at Robinhood. My career path up to this point has been a bit of a windy one. So long ago, I worked in baseball operations with the Oakland A's. That unit, that baseball operations team, was charged with developing a strategy and building a team for success on the field, right? And it was also the group that was featured in the book and the movie Moneyball. I was determined at that stage in my life to be the next big baseball executive, but alas, I got rerouted to a 14-year career in academia, which maybe I'll talk about at next year's conference, and ultimately found myself at Robinhood. But this talk, of course, connects to my time in baseball. Back then, we're talking early 2000s, dating myself just a little bit, baseball analytics wasn't yet really a thing, right? The really good predictive data wasn't widely available at that point in time. And then within baseball, a lot of decisions were made based on sort of like the expertise and observations and even intuition of like coaches, scouts, and executives, which of course led to imperfect decisions over time. The A's were one of the few organizations at that time that were starting to really question that approach. And I was hired to help them explore what kinds of data might be most useful in gaining a competitive advantage. I was learning how to use data to make better decisions at that time and ultimately how to become a better researcher. And that's what that group was all about. It was finding ways to use data to make better decisions. And so I want to spend some time talking about how exactly they did that, how exactly they disrupted, and why it's such a big deal. So as you check out some of these like kind of funny photos, this was taken with like a plastic disposable camera, again dating myself just a little bit. This is from the last game of the season. The A's had just clinched the division, so there was a clubhouse celebration. These are some of the star players with the team, so I was in the clubhouse snapping some selfies before selfies were a thing. But as you look at these, I want to share with you a little bit some of the goals I have for today's talk. First, I want to kind of shift the mindset away from thinking about research as a series of one-off studies and get you to start thinking about your research in probabilities and building confidence over time. Second, I think this sort of subtle mind shift in how you approach your research will have impacts both for how you analyze data, but also how you present and share data with stakeholders. And I'll walk you through examples of both of those. Finally, I want to talk about the inputs that help us gain confidence in our insights over time, and that, of course, is the data. I want to make the case for exploring multiple sources of data, which is probably not novel to anyone in here, but also to get you to start thinking about pursuing new questions, even those questions that your stakeholders may or may not be asking for. But first, let's rewind a little bit. I'm under no assumptions that everybody here knows about Moneyball, so let me recap just a little bit to give you some context over what this whole story is all about. So the A's are a baseball team that for now plays right across the bridge here in Oakland. They're a smaller market team by Major League Baseball standards, and as a team with low payroll, they have sort of, in a smaller market, they have less money to pay their players. But for many years, despite being sort of one of the cheaper or lower payroll teams, they were actually one of the best teams in the league. Their success was largely attributed to their revolutionary new approach using largely quantitative data to inform their decision making. They were such an anomaly and so unorthodox in their approach that Michael Lewis wrote a book about it, and that book ultimately became a movie. Now you might be thinking to yourself, like, an organization using research and data to gain competitive advantage, like what's the big deal? Like this is like what we all do, right? But what made Moneyball such a phenomenon specifically, and maybe the question you're asking yourself most of all is like, what does any of this have to do with UX research? I promise I'll get there. So prior to Moneyball, baseball, and I suppose you could say this about a lot of industries, was an old institution where norms and best practices for evaluating players and creating game strategies was rarely questioned. Decisions were made based on like incomplete or suboptimal data, like I said before, even just the intuition of coaches, scouts, executives. And poor decisions or poor outcomes were attributed to bad luck or explained away with sayings like, the ball just didn't bounce our way today. But the A's were ultimately like really dissatisfied with this explanation and ultimately dissatisfied with the inputs that went into their decision making. So Moneyball was really about data. It was about any data, all data, anything that we could find, and not just quant data. I swear to you, I would not come to this conference speaking about the virtues of analytics. Wrong audience for that. What's interesting about the A's that very few people know is that like they took this heavy quant approach, but really it was their qualitative team of scouts and executives that was amongst the largest in all of baseball. So just because there was like all this new quantitative data informing their decisions didn't mean they were going to discount all the qualitative insights that they had learned up to that point and continue to learn over time. And sometimes it was like the quant informing the qual, sometimes the qual informing the quant, but because this was a new approach, there was like a lot of conflict between the two approaches, which made for like really fun storylines in the movie. But make no mistake about it, the A's were a robust mixed methods research team. We wanted to win desperately, and we wanted to understand the data that was going to help us win. And that was my job, to help us identify that data. And that's still my job, right? And so whether watching players or watching users or informing game strategy or product strategy, the goal remains the same. We're looking for like deep knowledge of our users or our players to gain an understanding or have strong predictions about how they're going to interact with our products or how they're going to play in the game, with the purposes so that we can gain a competitive advantage. Of course, with the knowledge that like humans are imperfect and impossible to predict with 100% certainty. Now, over the years, I've spoken a lot about my experience with the A's, and I've struggled to find a framework that really captures what Moneyball is all about. There's so many misinterpretations of like what a Moneyball approach really means, and given my experience, I feel a little bit of an obligation to clarify. And years ago, I came across this beauty, right? Which is now where I often redirect conversations about Moneyball. This is Bayes' theorem. Now, so like I said, this is where I like redirect conversations, but like if you're in a bar talking with your friends about like your experiences with Moneyball, like nobody wants to talk about theorems and mathematical expressions. But what's beautiful about Bayes' theorem is that it's not just a mathematical expression. We can think about this mathematically, but we can also think of it conceptually as more broadly representative of an approach to research, data, and predictions. So let me explain briefly, and caveats to any experts in Bayesian theory in the audience. I'm going to give like the 15-second explanation of what's clearly a much more nuanced set of ideas, so forgive me. But we need just a few data points to populate this expression. First is a very important concept which we call prior probability. That's effectively our understanding of the likelihood that a certain event is going to occur given the data that we already have. The second data point is the new evidence we're introducing into this problem or question that we're asking. And finally, we need to understand the likelihood that that new evidence would have appeared if our prior predictions were right or if they were just fundamentally wrong. The sacrifice bunt was a good strategic choice. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, the sacrifice bunt is a play where the batter gently hits the ball in front of home plate, sacrifices himself by making one of the 3 outs in the inning. The trade-off is that one of his teammates gets to advance to second base. Now that he's on second base, this player, who's very happy about being there, is considered to be in scoring position, where he's more likely to score if the next batter gets a hit. I spent an entire summer counting the number of runs that the A's scored with each base runner and out combination. So like runner on first, 1 out, runner on second, 2 outs, runners on first and second, 0 outs, and so on. So based on this data, which was honestly one of the most tedious things I've ever done in my life, which you could also probably run a query for and get an answer for in about 5 seconds today. This took me honestly an entire summer. But given the data we collected, we concluded that this was not a good strategic choice. And the A's, and actually baseball at large, has largely moved away from the sacrifice bunt as a strategy, which I, to this day, consider my most profound contribution to humanity. But as I've become more Bayesian in my thinking and as more data has become available, I think this question isn't so simple, and I think the A's would likely agree. There are so many, countless data points that influence this decision that aren't accounted for in my counting. Is the batter good at bunting? Is the pitcher hard to bunt against? Is the pitcher tired? What's the weather? Where's the defense standing? Who's the next batter? Is that batter doing well? Is that batter hungover? Bayes tells me that I can start with my counting as that prior probability, that prior estimate of the likelihood of scoring a run, but that I need to continue to layer in additional data to update my confidence in the outcome that I'm looking for, which is scoring a run in this case. Clearly, there are circumstances where the sacrifice bunt has worked in the past. So our job as researchers is to figure out, not just put a blanket statement over at only 40% of the time it works, we're not going to do it. It's to identify, the 40% of the time that it works. What are the circumstances surrounding that? And can we identify those to make even more optimal decisions over time? So hopefully this gives you a little bit of a sense of Bayes' theorem and kind of the framework for this talk. But let's talk and bring it back to UX research about what it means to be a Bayesian researcher or Bayesian thinker in the context of UXR. From my view, there are 2 guiding principles if you're a UX researcher trying to embrace sort of Bayesian thinking in your research. The first is to think in probabilities. So by sort of embracing this idea, we're gaining confidence through thinking about our individual data points as part of a larger program of research rather than just a series of one-off studies. There we go. Okay, so I lied. Actually, we're going to do the math. Only this time, rather than talking about sacrifice bunts, I'm going to walk through a scenario that's probably quite common to something we might see in UX research. So here's the scenario, and let me lay this out. The product team is under the assumption that there's room to improve our search feature, right? At current, only 20% of our users say that our search feature is useful. We'll talk later about where that data point comes from. But in terms of the Bayes expression, this is our prior probability, a really important data point in all this. We go to our product design and content partners, we say, we gotta rev on this. We gotta make a really cool new version of our search feature. So we do so, build a prototype, looks great, run a usability test, put this prototype in front of our users, and in that we find that 90% of our participants find V2 of our search feature to be incredibly useful. Now, do we feel comfortable going back to our stakeholders saying 90% of our users found this feature useful? That means that 90% of our users in the future are going to find this feature useful? Do we feel comfortable populating that 90% data point into our fiscal year or quarterly forecasts? Bayes says not so fast, right? We cannot ignore our prior knowledge, that prior 20% knowledge that we have of the percentage of users, or our estimate of the number of users who find our search feature useful. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over a detailed deep dive into the math, but feel free to ask questions later or flag me for those who are in person. But the output after punching in all the numbers is 0.69. Now, translated back to English, that means that after running the research, the probability that users find the search feature useful, considering both our prior knowledge and our current research that we've just run is 69%. Now, 69% confidence hits a little bit differently than 90%, right? We love running to our stakeholders with like 90% confidence, right? But it's still a great result. But at 69%, we might make a more cautious recommendation, right? We might not jump to conclusions about like, this is, the world's greatest new search feature. We got to run with this. We got to feature this. At 69%, you might like pump the brakes on that a little bit and make a more cautious suggestion or recommendation. Or you might simply suggest that we need to run more research to increase that certainty from 69 to something higher, where you feel a little bit more confident in making the suggestion that we should move forward and actually build this feature. Now, the point of Bayes' theorem then isn't to diminish the confidence we have in our results. It's actually quite the opposite. By considering all of the research that we've ever run, all the data points that have any predictive value and its ability to answer our key question about users' perception of our search feature, we actually gain confidence in our results. And as we continue with this line of research, this 69% data point becomes our prior probability for our next round of research. And then we input new data and we start the process over again. So we're continually adding new data. You'll hear me refer to the phrase, all research is additive. That's kind of what we're referring to here. So let's look at this more conceptually and less mathematically. Again, in our typical one-off usability study, we run the research, take this data point, write up a cool 2-pager, a nice deck, and share it with our stakeholders. But what is Bayes adding? Of course, Bayes is saying we absolutely must consider the 20% data point that we had previously. And really, by forcing us to consider this 20% data point, we're fundamentally rejecting the idea that any study is a one-off study, that like that thing just doesn't exist. Because when we analyze any data, we're not just analyzing this data, but we're analyzing the rest of it too. So where does that 20% number come from? We might imagine a survey question, right, where we ask people their perceived utility of the search feature. Should we stop there? Is that good enough? For smaller and less mature or newer research teams, that may be the only data point, and that's wonderful. But as we grow in our research program, that single data point shouldn't be the only thing populating our prior probability. In fact, it should be a culmination, again, of all the data points that have any predictive value in their ability to answer the question of, will users find the search feature useful? So we consider customer service data, log data, that survey result that I just mentioned, previous usability research that we ran on the old version, social media mentions and conversations, Discord and Reddit threads and conversations that we see online. All of those data points inform our recommendation and give us confidence in our recommendation. So ultimately, our analysis needs to consider all of this. So when you present your results and you present your findings, present not only this, but all of that too. And this is really the conceptual approach or the conceptual way of thinking of Bayes' theorem. The probabilistic way of thinking is actually exactly how AI works, right? So it takes all of the inputs and it figures out what the most likely output is given the data that it's provided. It continues to update those outputs as it learns more information or is given additional prompts. But ChatGPT doesn't share probabilities. It only shares the most likely answers and kind of speaks in certainties, right? Wouldn't it be great if ChatGPT had like a confidence meter for its responses? Like, here's the output, but I'm like only 70% sure it's right based on the inputs that I have. What if we as researchers were more open about attaching levels of confidence, not only to our insights, but to our recommendations? What if we openly shared the inputs into our Bayesian expression, including all the prior knowledge that we had from that previous slide that informed our insight and our recommendation for the product? Wouldn't that give stakeholders more confidence in the research that we've run? Also, as we are all full-time, or many of us full-time embedded researchers on research teams, we can quickly build our confidence by running multiple research studies and gaining confidence over time. But because of its probabilistic approach, ChatGPT actually also provides a great model for how to process inputs. So ask your inner ChatGPT, what are the 2 to 3 most important questions about your user? So if you're working on a team that oversees this search feature, one of your key questions is, do users find this feature useful? And you should write short, pithy responses, kind of like ChatGPT might give you, and update those responses after each study that you do and each amount of data you collect, and attach a level of confidence in that result as you gain additional insight. You may have sort of different answers for different segments. You may ultimately change the questions over time, but ultimately it's really important to, from time to time, take the 30,000-foot view of your research and make sure you're considering all the data points. But this Bayesian approach has one key requirement for it to work well, and that's high-quality data. And the second guiding principle I'll chat with briefly is to transform the way you think about data. Bayes' theorem fundamentally doesn't work, even mathematically, if the inputs don't impact the outputs. So if we're to continually update our knowledge, we need to cast a wide net of what we consider to be a valuable and predictive input. I love UXR for the creative approaches we all take in getting the answers we need about our users. But there's still more valuable data out there. Think of all the data sources we often overlook in favor of running a fresh set of IDIs. Thinking about academic research, expert interviews, competitive research, content analyses of social media or in-app content, stakeholder employee interviews, even rigorous autoethnographies, which we rarely talk about. From the quant side, eye tracking, click tracking are great examples of data point that help us gain an understanding or complete the puzzle of how our users interact with digital content. In baseball analytics, they're doing the same thing and starting to think about new quantitative outputs like spin rates, launch angles, and exit velocities, and even some biometric data. In school, we were always taught about the importance of triangulating your data sources. Well, Bayes' theorem just demands it. So in your research, give yourself a little bit of freedom to pursue new questions and new data points. You're a researcher, but you're also an expert with deep knowledge of your users and your products. Use that expertise to identify opportunities to ask new questions and think about your users in new ways. In UXR, we're often forced to run like quick iterative studies, and the scope of that research is always narrowed for the purposes of hitting deadlines. I'm preaching to the choir here, but this is a big mistake. We always need to make room for additional discovery. So one of the rules I abide by in the research that I do is what I call the 10% rule. This means that 10% of every study that I run is mine, to explore new data points, to test unproven hypotheses, or even to revisit previous assumptions to ensure that they're still valid. I just think at the end of any IDI, like you could add 5 minutes to talk about a new concept, or you could add 2 to 3 questions to the end of a survey to explore a new way of thinking about segmentation and see if something cool emerges. But you always need to give yourself the freedom to explore new data. You could also think about it as like 10% of your research roadmap is for you to think about questions that you think will have a big impact on your Bayesian equation. Of course, you have to get stakeholder, probably manager buy-in too for this kind of research. But I'd argue that even just thinking about these kinds of outside-the-box questions will force you to think about your users in new ways. Of course, not every one of these studies is going to land. Not every hypothesis we tested with the A's turned into anything meaningful, but we never would have changed the game if we didn't ask the questions in the first place. So as you leave today and you start to think about your next round of research, I hope you infuse a little bit of Bayesian thinking into your work. Start to think in probabilities, right? Remember that all the research you've done to date informs the research that you're doing today. Use Bayes' theorem either mathematically, and you can punch in the numbers, or even just conceptually, and start to factor in old research in your analysis instead of just the most recent studies that you've done. Always update the level of confidence you have in your results based on the quality and quantity of the inputs you have at your disposal. But again, make sure to take a step back and think about the 2 to 3 most important questions about your users. create those ChatGPT-like responses and update your prevailing wisdom or knowledge about your users. And again, update that after each study that you do. From the data side, always invite new data into your work. Get creative and start to think beyond the most common data sources, and give yourself 10% to explore the questions, the new questions that helps you understand your users in new ways. That data will give you fresh perspective and more confidence in your results over time. Remember that for humans, nothing is 100% certain. So whether you're researching users or players or game strategy or product strategy, it's the data that's the key to unlocking confidence in your results. Thanks so much for listening. Really appreciate your time. Excited for today. Hopefully there's some time for some questions.